What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I wanted to just recap a few of the fights that took place over the weekend. We can't get to like all the fights. I mean, there were several good ones, but the ones we will briefly go over are the Josh Taylor versus Jack Catterall, Lawrence Okolie versus Mikhail Cieslak, Chris Colbert versus Hector Garcia, and Gary Antoine Russell, younger brother of Gary Russell Jr. versus Victor Postol. And I want to kick it off with Josh Taylor versus Jack Catterall. I thought that Josh Taylor, even if he came in a little flat, a little rusty because of the, several cancellations of the fight or postponements of the fight, the fact that, in this case, he's fighting a, just a lesser tier Jack Catterall and not like a battle for, 2 new titles and fighting Jose Ramirez to become undisputed champion or the finals in the World Boxing Super Series versus Regis Prograis. It just seems like Josh Taylor's had like a lot of fights that were of such high magnitude and consequence that, you could see him maybe taking the foot off the gas a little bit in his preparation against Jack Catterall. Well, I thought that even if we did get a slightly reduced or less motivated version of Josh Taylor, that by the middle rounds, he would more or less have this thing in control. And you could say that he won the majority of the later rounds, but I really felt like, I don't think he dominated the second half of the fight. I mean, he was using certain tactics that can be interpreted as dirty, but really just trying to muddy the waters, because one of the most surprising things about this fight was, and we saw this from the opening round, was that Jack Catterall was able to hit him with the right jab and with the straight left hand. Now, this was a case of southpaw versus southpaw, but all this aside, I thought that Josh Taylor was going to probably stop Jack Catterall. If not, then win at least via convincing unanimous decision, to where it was only like the guts and grit that keeps Jack Catterall in the fight. But through the first 4 rounds, I had this thing 3-1 Jack Catterall, and I thought that it was interesting because I think it was Andre Ward's unofficial scorecard on the broadcast had it like I think he had it 3-1 Josh Taylor after 4 rounds. And I saw that and I'm thinking, what the hell is Andre Ward, with all due respect, what is he seeing in this to give 3 of the first 4 rounds to Josh Taylor, who, I mean, he was getting hit so flush with the jab that it looked a couple times like his leg kind of wobbled, or if not wobbled, at least had to kind of steady itself. Again, Jack Catterall, I think he was a lot quicker than Taylor anticipated. He was certainly like kind of cagey. He would take a step back, and then, just shoot the left hand. It was Taylor trying to press the issue, but he looked like he just didn't have enough like trunk movement or head movement to stay out of the way of the punches that Jack Catterall was throwing. It was like it's one thing if you're not outputting with the same volume that we're used to seeing with Josh Taylor, but it's another thing if defensively, if you are becoming so much easier to hit. Now, Josh Taylor, he is often such an aggressive offensive fighter that sometimes, he'll get hit in the exchanges because he's engaging so aggressively. But that wasn't the case here. Taylor was trying to find his way in, was trying to methodically get his way into the pocket, and was getting caught by jab, left hand. And I'm thinking, whoa, like if Taylor's not careful here, Jack Catterall might stop Josh Taylor. And this was like more or less the case, not only through the first 4 rounds, but 5, 6. Josh Taylor got dropped in the 8th round. And if you look at like boxing scenes, unofficial scoring, but usually boxing scene, they usually have pretty reasonable scorecards. And they scored this one 114 to 111 for Jack Catterall. So for an official judge to have this one 114 to 111 Josh Taylor, look, I'm not going to call the overall result of this fight a robbery. You could say it was kind of close to a robbery. I definitely think that Jack Catterall deserved the decision win. 114 to 111 Josh Taylor's BS. And, the argument can be made that Jack Catterall, left this one in the judge's hands, not just because he didn't stop Josh Taylor, but because he did wane a bit in the second half of the fight. Taylor started to come on a little bit stronger. Jack Catterall clearly looked tired. He was throwing so fewer punches in the second half of the fight that I was wondering if he had hurt his left hand or something. But I thought, again, Josh Taylor was coming on stronger in the second half of the fight. I don't think he deserved the decision win here. I think Jack Catterall should have walked away with this or from this fight with all 4 of Josh Taylor's belts, but it didn't work out that way. Split decision win for Josh Taylor. Of course, this is going to raise a ton of questions in terms of how good is Josh Taylor. I'm looking at this one more as the exception than the rule. I'm not going to make too much out of this lack of performance from Josh Taylor. I think that it's more likely that in his next fight, whether it's against an elite opponent or not, I think it's going to be truer to what we've been accustomed to seeing from Josh Taylor. You know, it's going to be interesting to see where they matchmake Jack Catterall next. Like, will we see a Pro Bellum partnership or something where Jack Catterall perhaps fights a Regis Prograis? Perhaps Jose Zepeda, or, you know, the winner or loser out of the Jose Ramirez versus Jose Pedraza fight. That could be a good matchup either way you go there. But Jack Catterall definitely upped his stock just on the, you know, boxing landscape. And if we didn't know then, we know now that he is a force to be reckoned with. Again, I think he should be the undisputed champion. You know, this was kind of shades of Teofimo Lopez versus George Kambosos, to where, you know, Teofimo, there were several cancellations and postponements. You know, Teofimo Lopez, none of us were really giving George Kambosos a big shot. We thought that his only shot would be some slippage of Teofimo Lopez's preparation or game. Pretty much felt the same thing with Taylor versus Catterall here. And Josh Taylor, like Teofimo Lopez, was coming off of the biggest win of his career against Jose Ramirez, where he captured all 4 belts. Teofimo Lopez was coming off of that win versus Vasily Lomachenko taking all of Lomachenko's belts. So, you know, similar but different situation. But the biggest difference is obviously that George Kambosos was fairly awarded the decision win, whereas Jack Catterall, unfortunately, in my book, was not. Let's move on to Lawrence Okolie versus Mikhail Cieslak out of Poland. We've got the Nigerian Brit, Lawrence Okolie, WBO Cruiserweight champion, undefeated fighter, still kind of green. You know, he hasn't had like more than 20 fights. He was like 18 or 19-0 or something like that. Michael Cieslak, his only loss was against Junior Makabu. Okolie was a big favorite here. I thought that Cieslak could pose an interesting issue if he tries to bomb early and aggressively from the outside, try to catch Okolie with something. But I thought that Okolie would have this one well in control by the middle rounds. I thought that Mikhail Cieslak would be a victim of Lawrence Okolie's jab. Cieslak is taller than a lot of the cruiserweights, but Okolie's very tall for the division. Okolie 6'5", Cieslak 6'3". So this was a rare case where Cieslak's going to be fighting a taller fighter. When Cieslak fought and lost to Junior Makabu, Makabu's about 6 feet 6'1". Okolie, again, 6'5", with like an 82.5-inch reach. But, you know, Cieslak actually muddied the waters to the point where Okolie wasn't able to land a ton of good offense. He did drop Cieslak in this fight, and that did help to broaden the scorecards. This was a unanimous decision win for Okolie. But if you look at the scorecards, one of the scorecards was like 115 to 112, which I don't agree with. I thought that the other judges had it more in the right spot with 117 to 110 and then 116 to 111. That was more reflective of the fight I saw. But Cieslak definitely muddied the waters. It was one of those situations where it's like both guys get like a chance to throw like one punch and then they're in a clinch, a dirty clinch, and then they start just rabbit punching each other, just exchanging rabbit punches and you know, body punches in the clinch and from the break. It was a, you know, one of those things where even at the bell that they continue activity for 1 or 2 more punches. Just an ugly fight altogether. There are going to be a lot of questions raised as to like how good is Lawrence Okolie. You know, boxing IQ is one of the terms that you hear floated out there. Like, you know, we know that he's a talented fighter. And look, he's got a great jab. I think that any boxing IQ questions will kind of be overblown a bit, because it's hard to look good against somebody who's fighting in the way that Cieslak was. It wasn't a fight that was fought at distance where it's a tit for tat type of thing. Again, Okolie would get like one shot at a big shot as Cieslak jumps into the pocket. Maybe Okolie could have worked in more uppercuts or something like that. Cieslak hit Okolie with a couple of uppercuts. But yeah, this wasn't the type of fight that showcased Lawrence Okolie's talents and skills. Instead, this made Cieslak looked like a game opponent, which he was. Again, he was a top 10 cruiserweight according to Ring Magazine. He was hovering around like, I think 8 or something like that. Again, only one loss. So I thought that this was the second best opponent Okolie's had. First being Krzysztof Glowacki, who is also a Polish fighter, and Okolie gave him a pretty bad beating en route to a knockout win for Okolie. But I think that that was actually a far diminished version of Glowacki. Like, he was not the same Glowacki who we saw fight Alexander Usyk or even Maris Briedis more recently than that. And those are like a couple of Glowacki's other losses. But the one that fought Okolie was just so flat-footed that he was just at the mercy and at the end of that jab for as long as Okolie was throwing it, until Okolie got him to, bottle up and then started exploding to the body with devastating power punches. He wasn't getting any of those opportunities really here against Cieslak. But he did come away with the fight with a unanimous decision win. He did, again, drop Cieslak in the middle rounds of this fight. And for a while, I thought that this fight was on the verge of being, stopped. But no, Cieslak, hung in there, frustrating Okolie. Definitely got some work into the back of the head. Both of these fighters did. Again, just an ugly fight. Okolie, it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. I hope that they can make a Lawrence Okolie versus Maris Briedis title unification fight. If not that, then I hope that we could get maybe Okolie versus Junior Makabu for, 2 of the titles, the WBO and the WBC title. Or maybe Lawrence Okolie versus Dorticos, who is one of the top fighters in the division as well. Recently lost a competitive decision loss against Maris Briedis at the end of this most recent World Boxing Super Series, the Cruiserweight edition. But yeah, let me know what you think about Okolie versus Cieslak. Chris Colbert versus Hector Garcia. Garcia was a late replacement. This was supposed to be a title opportunity for Chris Colbert against Roger Gutierrez, who recently was elevated from like an interim champ to an actual champ. Chris Colbert was about to get a crack at that title. Gutierrez had to pull out of the fight. Insert late replacement Hector Garcia, a southpaw. Chris Colbert, I don't know if it was a lack of motivation because of the disappointment and the letdown from having a title opportunity to now you got to fight this guy who's like a total no-name. Like, only hardcore boxing fans would have been really aware of Hector Garcia going into this fight. Well, they're aware of him now. This fight was not close, not a disputed decision win. This was a clear, unanimous decision win for Hector Garcia. He dropped Colbert. Colbert had to fight like his life depended on it to even go the distance here. I was sure, like halfway into this fight, like, yeah, Colbert's not going to make it out of this fight. Not only are we going to get an upset, but it's going to be a knockout win for Hector Garcia. Chris Colbert, he was losing from the onset of this fight. Like, he's kind of a fast puncher. He doesn't have the most volume, which is sometimes a problem for somebody who wants to pot shot. I'm not calling Chris Colbert a pot shotter, but Garcia was by far the busier fighter. He was definitely the one who was putting his combinations together, and he just seemed like he wanted it more. He was backing Chris Colbert up early, breaking off like jab, jab. Then he was going to the body, then up top with a straight left hand. There were a lot of instances where Chris Colbert clearly didn't appear to be preparing for a southpaw because he was just eating a lot of those left hands, which then enabled Garcia to go to the body more and just to put an all-around beating on Chris Colbert, who again was really fighting tooth and nail just to make it out of some of these rounds. It really wasn't looking good for Colbert. Like, he's kind of like there's a lot of levity in his presentation. He, colors his hair. He, has a lot of dances when he's like entering the ring in interviews and in his workouts. Just kind of like a fun-loving type of, boxing personality. Talks a lot of trash, gives interesting interviews and a lot of honest opinions that kind of get him in hot water sometimes. But yeah, all of that did not matter when he was in this ring against Hector Garcia. He looked like he was up against it. Like, he was not having a good time in there. So, when you have these undefeated prospects who are being billed and brought up in a certain way, I thought that Chris Colbert fighting King Tug Niambiar was a good step up for him, and he handled that fight really well. Well, not so much the case in this one. So this is a case of, hot prospect who, again, was about to have a title opportunity, totally having that hype train derail. Like, this is pretty disastrous, especially depending on how you recover from a loss like this. Sometimes we see a fighter lose when they're on the upswing with all the momentum going and being one of the hot prospect names. We see some of these prospects fall off and not really ever recover reputation-wise, confidence-wise. Your veil of invincibility is gone. So now every fighter who goes against Chris Colbert is going to know, like, hey, if I put some heavy artillery on against them and, you know, come in hot, really make them work, mix up the attack high and low. I mean, not everybody's a southpaw, so not everybody could carry out the game plan of Hector Garcia, but now at least there is a blueprint that's established and at least a precedent in knowing, yeah, I feel like I could get to Chris Colbert. So it's going to be interesting how they match make here for Chris Colbert, especially given PBC's, you know, thin roster at the weights that Chris Colbert competes in. He's a 130, about to be 135-ish guy. And if you look at the top 10, you know, 130 guys, for instance, most of these guys aren't on PBC. Shakur Stevenson, Miguel Burchell, Jamel Herring, Shavkat Rakimov. These are all guys with other promoters. So, you know, he's going to need a just get back in the ring, get your confidence back type of fight anyway. But even going forward, I thought matchmaking was going to be an issue because, I mean, you just look at how creative they're having to be in matchmaking for Gervonta Davis, given their thin roster at 140, 135, and 130. I was already curious as to how they were going to matchmake with Chris Colbert. They're going to even have to be a little bit more delicate and creative going forward, given the result of this Colbert versus Hector Garcia fight. This was not a good night at the office for Chris Colbert. So yeah, keep your eye on him, and it's going to be interesting how they matchmake for Hector Garcia, who now is probably going to get that title opportunity against Roger Gutierrez. So we'll see how you know, that matchmaking plays out. The final fight I want to get to is Gary Antoine Russell versus Victor Postol. Victor Postol, former 140-pound title holder. He was undefeated for some time. I think it was Terrence Crawford who gave him his first professional loss. Victor Postol before that had stopped Lucas Matisse and earned a title. And so Victor Postol, you know, 38, 39 years old now. His country is under war right now, the Ukraine. So Victor Postol is probably on his way back to the Ukraine as we speak. And, you know, we just saw Gary Antoine Russell's older brother, Gary Russell Jr., fight Mark Magsayo, and we saw Gary Russell Jr. suffer only his second loss in his entire career in a fight where he clearly, like, hurt his shoulder, was only able to use one hand for most of the fight, and was still somehow able to make that fight competitive. I thought it was a brilliant performance for Gary Russell Jr. No, he didn't deserve any decision win. He lost the fight, but damn, that was still impressive. To fight that long with one hand and still manage to keep the rounds close and competitive and even win a couple of those rounds. Yeah, but younger brother Gary Antoine Russell, not nearly as heralded or experienced as Gary Russell Jr. Gary Antoine Russell is on the upswing right now, and this was a major step-up opponent. I was actually surprised at the level of step-up that he was willing to take here against the former champ Postol, whose, you know, only losses came against Josh Taylor, as I mentioned, Terrence Crawford several years before that, and then most recently against Jose Ramirez. And in all of these fights, Postol was competitive, especially in the fights against Josh Taylor and Jose Ramirez. This is the first person to ever stop Victor Postol. Russell's stoppage of Postol came via 10th round TKO. You really have questions on whether Postol is done. Again, he's like 38, 39 years old now, so that's very old, especially in these lower weight classes. And he fought kind of old. Like, he wasn't as quick. He didn't move around the ring as well. He wasn't as snappy with his punches. His reflexes weren't as sharp. I think it would have been a totally different fight if we were to get like prime or near prime Victor Postol in here, but I don't want to take too much away from Gary Antoine Russell's performance here. You know, he was jabbing in with big, you know, long jabs for being, you know, a shorter fighter. Postol was taller. Gary Russell, you know, was built kind of like a muscular pit bull, coming in with the up jabs, getting in on Postol and landing power punches to where he basically had Postol backing up, trying to get out of harm's way, trying to buy time. I hadn't seen anybody really put the pressure on Postol to where they had him wilt in the way that Gary Antoine Russell was able to. So it's going to be interesting to see how they matchmake with Russell going forward. Maybe Russell versus Mario Barrios or something like that. Just kind of factoring in the PBC stable at 140. But yeah, Gary Antoine Russell surprised me here. I thought this was going to be a razor thin decision win for either one of these guys. I thought it was going to be one of those split decision scenarios, but nah. Russell took control in this one, ended up stopping Postol in the 10th and final round via TKO. Did they need to stop the fight? No. It was kind of one of those, like, really? Sort of like when they stopped the Anthony Joshua Carlos Takam fight, when Takam looked like he was still, you know, maybe not in the fight in terms of like having a good chance at winning, but he wasn't like on the verge of getting knocked out or anywhere near that. It didn't appear. And I thought that they stopped the Joshua Takam one to keep Anthony Joshua's knockout streak going, because this is when he was still undefeated, knocking out all of his opponents. But yeah, I didn't love the stoppage here, but you know, I'm not going to make a big complaint out of it. Postol, when it was stopped, was like, really? And it was just one of those, whatever. But yeah, great performance from Gary Antoine Russell. Keep your eye on him, and I expect Postol to either retire or to have maybe one or two final fights, maybe something back in his home country, given obviously the global situation that we are undergoing. But yeah, let me know what you thought about those fights. Taylor versus Catterall, Okolie versus Cieslak, Colbert versus Garcia, and Russell versus Postol. And if there were any other fights that you want to comment on, the Campbell Hatton fight, there were a couple fights on the Okolie versus Cieslak undercard that were pretty great as well. But yeah, let me know in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.